Drew had always dreamed of owning his own home, one with a spacious backyard and a sparkling pool where he could unwind after long work weeks. After years of saving and hard work, that dream became a reality. His new house was perfect, tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood with friendly faces and neatly trimmed lawns. Every Saturday morning, Drew would brew his coffee, grab a book, and head out to the pool to enjoy the sun. But lately, his peaceful weekends had been anything but relaxing. The source of his frustration? Betty. Betty was a heavy-set blonde woman with a perpetual scowl and an oversized sun hat. She wasn't officially in charge of the HOA, but that didn't stop her from acting like it. Self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, she strutted around as if she owned every property on the block, including Drew's. It started small. One afternoon, Drew found Betty lounging by his pool, reading a magazine. She greeted him casually, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. When he asked her to leave, she waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm just enjoying the pool for a bit." "You weren't even using it." Drew, taken aback, didn't push the issue. He valued keeping the peace and hoped it was a one-time thing. But it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, Betty's visits became more frequent. She began treating Drew's pool like her own private oasis, splashing around, blasting music, even hosting small get-togethers with her friends. Drew would come home to find half-empty wine glasses scattered around, pool floats left in the water, and towels draped over his patio chairs. He tried confronting her again. "Betty, this is my property. You can't just use my pool whenever you want." She didn't even look up from her tanning chair. "I am the HOA," she said smugly, gesturing to the badge pinned to her wide-brimmed hat. "I make sure the neighborhood stays nice, and I'm just making sure your pool doesn't go to waste." Her sense of entitlement was suffocating. And worse, her comments often carried an ugly undertone. "I didn't expect someone like you to own a house here," she once muttered when Drew called her out again. The neighborhood seemed aware of Betty's behavior, but no one spoke up. She had a reputation for being petty and vindictive, especially with HOA-related matters. Drew felt trapped. This was supposed to be his sanctuary, and now he was being made to feel like an intruder on his own property. At first, he tried to ignore it, thinking she'd eventually get bored. But Betty only grew bolder, treating his pool as her own personal spa. Drew knew it was time to take action. It was a sweltering afternoon when Drew finally hit his breaking point. After a long day at work, all he wanted was to come home, kick back by the pool, and unwind. Instead, he was met with the sound of laughter and splashing as he pulled into his driveway. Peeking over the fence, his jaw clenched in frustration. There she was, Betty, lounging in his pool, margarita in hand, sun hat tilted back, her speaker blasting country music. She floated lazily on a giant inflatable swan while her friends sipped drinks poolside. Drew took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He stepped into the backyard. "Betty, what the hell? I told you to stop coming here." She didn't even flinch. She took a sip of her margarita and shrugged. "You weren't using it, Drew. It's just water. What's the big deal?" Her blatant disrespect ignited something inside him. Enough was enough. That night, Drew sat on his patio, fuming as he scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over one name, Tony. Tony had been one of Drew's closest friends since college. He ran a successful reptile business, specializing in exotic pets, educational shows, and rescue efforts. Drew remembered a hilarious story Tony once told about using a trained alligator in a prank video. That gave him an idea. He had called. "Drew. Long time, man. What's up?" Tony answered, upbeat as always. "I need a favor," Drew began, chuckling. "You still got that alligator?" Tony paused, then laughed. "I think I know where this is going." Drew explained the situation, the trespassing, the entitlement, the racist comments. Tony, always up for a bit of harmless fun and justice, was on board immediately. The plan was simple but effective. Tony would bring over one of his trained alligators, a gentle giant named Gus. Gus was muzzled and safe for demonstrations but looked intimidating enough to give anyone a serious scare. The next morning, Tony arrived with Gus in a large crate. They positioned it near the pool, hidden by bushes, and set up a mechanism to release Gus into the shallow end when the time was right. Drew double-checked everything. Safety was key. They wanted to prank Betty, not harm her. By noon, everything was ready. Drew didn't have to wait long. As predicted, Betty showed up around 2 p.m., pool bag slung over her shoulder, sunglasses perched on her nose. She let herself into the backyard as if she owned the place, stripped down to her swimsuit, and hopped into the pool. Drew, watching from a window, gave Tony the signal. The trap was set. The morning sun was already high when Drew sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on his backyard. He didn't have to wait long. Just as he suspected, Betty was back. She waddled through his gate, wearing a garish pink swimsuit stretched tightly over her frame and carrying an oversized beach bag. Without a hint of shame or hesitation, she plopped the bag on a lounge chair, set up her speaker, and blasted her favorite country tunes. "Ah, perfect day for a swim," she muttered to herself, adjusting her sun hat. Drew crouched behind the curtains inside, phone in hand, recording every second. Today was the day. Betty eased herself onto an inflatable swan float, kicked off the pool's edge, and drifted lazily in the water, eyes closed, soaking up the sun. Drew glanced at Tony, who stood hidden behind a tall hedge, the crate containing Gus, the muzzled, well-trained alligator, beside him. Drew nodded. Tony grinned and unlatched the crate. Gus, calm but curious, slowly crawled toward the pool's edge and slipped silently into the water. Betty floated obliviously, humming along to the music. Gus moved gracefully beneath the surface, his large body creating subtle ripples that approached the inflatable swan. Drew's heart raced. He could barely contain his laughter. Then it happened. Gus's snout gently bumped against Betty's float. She stirred, annoyed, thinking it was just a current. But when Gus's broad, toothy grin broke the water's surface, bumping the float again, her eyes shot open. She blinked, squinting under her sun hat, until she saw it. Alligator. There's an alligator. Betty thrashed wildly, her sun hat flying off as she flailed off the float and into the pool. She scrambled toward the shallow end, slipping and choking on water as she desperately clawed her way out. Drew, recording the entire scene, nearly doubled over laughing. Betty pulled herself onto the wet pool deck, gasping and trembling. But as she tried to run, her soaked feet slipped on the slick concrete, sending her sprawling across the lawn. She crawled away, shrieking, "Help! Somebody! There's an alligator!" Tony calmly stepped out from behind the bushes, whistling as Gus obediently swam toward him. "Good boy," Tony cooed, lifting the gentle reptile out of the water and placing him back in the crate. Betty, now hiding behind a tree, peeked out in horror. When she saw Tony handling the alligator with ease, the realization hit her. She'd been pranked. You monsters," she screamed before storming off, sopping wet and humiliated. For the next few days, Drew enjoyed something he hadn't experienced in weeks: complete peace. Betty was nowhere to be seen. No surprise visits. No uninvited pool parties. But deep down, Drew knew Betty wouldn't let the prank go unpunished. Betty's humiliation festered like an open wound. The image of her running drenched and screaming about an alligator replayed in her mind over and over. Worse, she'd overheard some neighbors laughing about it. Word the prank had spread fast. Her pride couldn't handle it. She needed revenge. 2 days after the alligator incident, Betty called an emergency HOA meeting. She stormed into the community center, wearing her best power suit, slamming a thick binder onto the table. The few HOA board members in attendance raised their eyebrows, unsure of what to expect. "Drew's house is a menace to this neighborhood," Betty barked. "He's violating HOA codes left and right. His pool is a hazard, his landscaping is subpar, and he's a threat to our community." One board member, Carol, frowned. "Betty, this seems extreme. What exactly are you proposing?" Betty leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "We need to make an example of him. Revoke his rights. I say we push to have his house condemned and bulldozed." A heavy silence filled the room. Carol blinked. "Betty, that's outrageous. You want to demolish his house over pool issues." Betty's face reddened. "I'm the HOA head. I make the rules." Unbeknownst to her, Drew had been preparing for this. For weeks, he'd been quietly documenting every instance of Betty's trespassing, harassment, and her barely veiled racist remarks. He had video recordings, voice memos, and even witness statements from a few neighbors who'd finally had enough of Betty's bullying. The following day, Drew requested to present his side to the HOA. He entered the community center with a calm demeanor, carrying a flash drive filled with incriminating evidence. "Thank you for letting me speak," Drew began, plugging in his drive. I know Betty's been making some serious claims about me, but I think it's only fair you see what's really been going on. He played a series of clips, Betty lounging in his pool uninvited, barking orders at him, and most damning, recordings of her spewing racist insults during their interactions. The board sat in stunned silence. Even Carol, who had always been diplomatic, looked visibly appalled. This isn't just trespassing, Drew continued. This is harassment. And it's been going on for months. Betty, who had snuck into the back of the meeting, tried to interject. Those videos are taken out of context. Enough, Betty, Carol snapped. This is unacceptable behavior, especially from someone representing the HOA. The board quickly voted to remove Betty from her position. Her authority was stripped on the spot. Betty's world crumbled in an instant. She stood there, red-faced and sputtering, as the weight of her actions finally caught up with her. Betty's fall from grace was swift and merciless. One day, she strutted around a neighborhood barking orders, the self-declared queen of the HOA. The next, she was the town's laughingstock. Videos of her shrieking about an alligator in Drew's pool had already made the rounds online, but now after being stripped of her HOA powers and publicly shamed for her racist remarks, her reputation was in absolute tatters. For days, Drew saw her sulking on her front porch, wrapped in a tattered bathrobe, clutching a bottle of cheap wine. The once proud enforcer of the community now looked like a ghost of herself, puffy-eyed, disheveled, and muttering angrily to anyone who dared walk by. But as Drew knew all too well, entitlement doesn't just vanish overnight. One humid afternoon, while Drew was watering his backyard plants, he noticed movement near his side gate. He crept over, phone in hand, and peered through the slats. There she was. Betty, wearing an oversized sun hat and oversized sunglasses, trying and failing to be stealthy, had a beach towel draped over her arm and a tote bag filled with snacks and sunscreen. "You gotta be kidding me," Drew muttered, hitting the record button on his phone. Betty pushed open the gate and strutted into the backyard like nothing had happened. Humming to herself, she spread her towel on a lounge chair, kicked off her sandals, and made a beeline for the pool. Drew stepped out from behind the patio column. "Betty, seriously?" She froze mid-step, but then, in typical Betty fashion, decided to double down. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I deserve this pool. This neighborhood owes me." Drew raised his phone, recording every second. "Betty, you've been stripped of HOA authority. You're trespassing." Her face twisted in fury, tears welling in her eyes. "You can't stop me. I built this community. I deserve this." Before he could say anything else, Betty stormed past him and plunged into the shallow end of the pool, splashing like a child throwing a tantrum. Drew, beyond fed up, dialed the police. Minutes later, sirens echoed through the neighborhood. Betty, now floating on her back and muttering under her breath, didn't even notice until two officers arrived at the gate. "Ma'am, step out of the pool," one officer ordered. Betty sat up stunned. "What? No, I'm just swimming. I'm allowed." "You're trespassing, ma'am," the officer clarified. "And you've been warned before." As the officers moved toward her, Betty panicked. "This is unfair. I've lived here longer than him. You're all against me," she wailed, flailing as they handcuffed her poolside. Drew kept filming as she was escorted, soaking wet and crying, through the neighborhood. Her shrill protests echoed down the street. And just like that, Betty was finally and officially gone. With Betty gone, an almost surreal calm settled over the neighborhood. The constant tension that had hovered over Drew's new home like a storm cloud dissipated overnight. Neighbors who had once peeked out from behind curtains now came forward, smiling, waving, and even apologizing for not stepping in sooner. "You really handled that well," Carol from down the street said one morning, handing Drew a plate of fresh-baked cookies. "We all saw what she put you through." Drew grinned. Better late than never. The video of Betty's poolside arrest had gone viral within hours of him posting it. Coupled with the earlier alligator prank, the internet had dubbed the saga HOA Karen versus the pool prankster. Memes flooded social media, some showing Betty's shocked face as she fled the alligator, others capturing her dramatic poolside arrest. It didn't take long before local news stations picked up the story. Reporters camped outside Drew's house for interviews, all eager to hear about the man who stood up to the HOA tyrant. But for Drew, the best part wasn't the newfound fame or viral memes. It was the simple joy of finally enjoying his home in peace. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Drew lounged by his pool, cold drink in hand, watching the crystal-clear water glisten under the sun. Tony arrived a few minutes later, leading Gus the alligator, now something of a local celebrity, safely enclosed in a reinforced tank. Brought the star of the show, Tony joked, patting the glass. Drew laughed. He deserves a victory lap. Neighbors gathered around, taking pictures with Gus, laughing about the prank that had exposed Betty's entitlement. The best part? The HOA, now under new leadership, sent Drew a formal apology for all the harassment he endured. They even offered to help cover the costs of added security measures, ensuring that nothing like this would ever happen again. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the yard, Drew leaned back content. Kids splashed in the pool, neighbors mingled, and laughter echoed around him. He took a deep breath, appreciating the peace. For months, Betty had tried to control and intimidate him, convinced that her entitlement made her untouchable. But in the end, karma had caught up with the sharp teeth of poetic justice. Drew smiled, sipping his drink. Sometimes life had a funny way of setting things right, especially when an alligator was involved.